I wanted to take a brief moment here to explain how I envision somebody learning English conversation skills and to give you a bit of an orientation about this particular podcast. First of all, podcasts platforms, some of them are only audio. Other platforms have both audio and video formats available. So my podcast is a video format, and you'll have, if you are using a podcast that only has sound, you'll have to find one that has a video format. This is my website here at the bottom of the first page. If you have an Android device, Podbean is the one I used. Apple devices, this same podcast can be found on iTunes. There's also a podcast platform called Podkicker that also incorporates both sound and video. So once again, if you're just using a podcast platform that only delivers sound, you may want to move over and enjoy the benefits of a video podcast platform, which these two have. Also, if you like, if you tap here on the website, this is Instagram, which many of you may be familiar with. Even if you're not a member of or have not signed up for Instagram, you can view all the Instagram 1-minute pearls of wisdom that I have to help you review what we've learned in these 40 hours. So by simply tapping on them, you'll be able to access those 1-minute Instagrams. Some of them introduce lessons, others are more instructional. So that is available to you also. Back to the podcast itself. Learning English follows the same format in my mind as those who would teach math skills. We all know how math skills are developed. They start with the addition, then you move on to subtraction, then on to multiplication, then on to division for all your basic skills. From that, people move on to, algebra, geometry, trigonometry. But suffice it to say, the basics of learning math, everybody sort of knows, having gone to school, that there's this natural progression with learning math. Learning a language is a bit more nuanced in that many never have learned a second language, are very unfamiliar with if there is a methodology which follows logically to help you build a certain skill level. And so what I've done here is my basic audience are people who wish to learn basic conversation skills. If you want to learn more advanced reading skills, books, magazines, newspapers, or writing skills of how to write essays, this is not for you. Those are more advanced skills. I have no idea how they're taught well. However, my specialty is with the absolute beginners. And what you have to see with my system is that basically I level it out into a 40-hour system. It's a very manageable system for people. It's a self-directed system. If people don't have the luxury of having a native speaker to teach them, they can still benefit from both the methodology and exercises to help them gain confidence in speaking. In the beginning, there are the basics being how questions and sentences are made in the past, the present, and the future. Those are the basic skills. I do have a section here for how to, which is simply how to say hello, how to ask for help, how to ask the price, these types of things. But then we move on to this 40-hour regimen of learning language. The way I envision learning a language is to focus not on vocabulary. Vocabulary learning is a lifetime effort. Most people who come to English, they know basics of some basic vocabulary. What I focus on, however, is helping them to express their feelings. Conversation is all about expressing feelings. And a number of times, having taught, you'll get people coming back after they've studied for a year, 2 years, 3 years, and they admit to you, I feel frustrated because I'm not really able to express myself. What they're really saying is they're not able to express their wealth of emotions that they have in their native tongue. And patterns basically are the venue, the avenue through which you express feelings in language. So I systematically teach you those patterns from the easiest to the more complicated. And we begin with very, very simple patterns, and each hour will run about the same as you'll see in the first lesson. If you tap on here, this is hour 1. These are the 6 patterns. We generally study between 6 and 10 patterns in an hour. We focus. There is a PDF here which is going to give you a game plan of where we're moving along this path to be able to express yourself in conversation. And if you press this PDF, it's going to show you, I mentioned to you this how-to area that we had, but more importantly, you see here the different hours. This is what we learn in this particular hour. In the second hour, these patterns, and in the third hour, these patterns, and so on. The natural progression of language, as I see it, to make it easier for the beginners, is we start off first with verbs and patterns associated in combination with verbs. Here you see V, that's just an abbreviation for verb. We then move on to how adjectives are utilized with patterns, and then with nouns and pronouns. So we go from verbs to adjectives to then nouns and pronouns. And then we go on to more complex patterns where patterns that we've learned earlier are combined with. And you'll see how this happens during the course. But the student has to know that there is a method to the madness. Here is a path they can take to acquire basic conversation skills where they'll always sound good. It will instill confidence in them because I have tried to identify what they're mostly going to hear from a native speaker, the feelings that they're expressing and how those are expressed. And they'll be able to identify those and then flow into the conversation with that. So my focus is these 40 hours. We end up here. But always at the beginning of every hour, you'll find this PDF. These are the patterns that we learn. The intro always has a basic introduction for these patterns highlighted. The rest of the patterns at the beginning, the exercises, these are all free YouTube videos. The PDFs are simple printouts that you can use to visualize the teaching method. And basically what we're doing is reinforcing at the beginning the 12 variables. Just like math has, the addition, and you learn skills, and then subtraction, multiplication, and division. Well, in conversation, you have these 12 variables. You have the questions, both the positive and the negative, in the present, past, and the future. And sentences. Yes, sentence, positive and negative, in the present, past, and future. There's 12 variables here. And these are attempts here to reinforce by randomly jumping back and forth between the past and the present, the future, the positive and the negative, to have the student become familiar with both the tenses and how to answer them. Always on the left here, on the right, there's a PDF which has the verbatim of what you're going to find spoken here. In the bottom, then, we do move on to a series. You'll see here this where you see pictures. And what this is basically 10 to 20 pictures utilizing the patterns here. And I imagine a conversation utilizing these photos. This PDF, once again, if you print it, has the verbatim of what you'll find in that video. This verbatim is not available on the podcast, but you can get them on the website. Also, one advantage of going to the website to look at a video is that there's a captions function where you can, where I show the caption at the bottom of the screen. That's not available on the podcast, however. So at the bottom also, you'll also find a place where there's teacher's tips, where if you're not accustomed to teaching conversation skills, I try to give you some support, some enthusiasm, to try to get your enthusiasm in teaching this particular methodology. The advantage that the native speaker has, even if they have never taught conversation skills, is that they know what sounds right and what sounds wrong. The student has come to you to find out how to sound right. It's through their many mistakes, because you hear them, that you're able to help them to begin to sound better, just like a native speaker. Patterns that we'll study in here rarely change. They, we move on to, in an hour or two, we move on to these set of patterns. There is the intro, and these, once again, we end up with these photos, which tries to stimulate conversation with the student. All of these exercises, except the first one where I introduce the patterns, all leave space for the student to either repeat the question or answer the question. So I ask a question, there's time then, ample time for them to answer. There's about 200 questions in each one. Some people will say, well, they don't know if they sound right or they sound wrong. I said, well, then just have them repeat the question. The question's right. So, plus the question-making skill is much more difficult than the sentence-making skill. So, if they're not confident in whether they sound right, they can simply go through some of the exercises and repeat the question. The attempt here is to help them to build confidence, to help them begin to have the words come out of their mouth, for them to gain a bit of fluency. Everyone stumbles at the beginning. That's natural. It's to be expected. Mistakes, hundreds, thousands of mistakes, but it's only through the mistakes that they will learn how to benefit from the study of patterns. So basically what you have here, once again, at this PDF, if you print here, this is going to bring you back to the format, showing you where we're going with each lesson. And these lessons build upon one another. The patterns that we learn here are also used in combination with these patterns. So we study the easiest first to get them used to it, then it's doubled up and tripled up with other patterns that we learned as we go along. In the podcast, you will see, let me go, for example, 18. You will see P relates to photo, of which these, of course, have photos. You see 1 to 18. What this is saying is that every pattern that they learn from lesson 1 to lesson 18 is incorporated in the questions that I ask of those photos. So this gives them, once again, they're generally about an hour long. They're 200 questions. And they will combine patterns that they've learned from 1 to 18. Nobody gets it the first time. You have to constantly reinforce. As a native speaker, you know what sounds good. And you can have confidence that as you're moving through this, even if you have no background skill or education in how to teach language, I'm sure that you can do it. In fact, I've never had any formal education on how to teach language. I was just confronted with, about 40 years ago, I got a job in Korea teaching English. I had no idea how to do that. But what I did know is that I wanted to make it easy for the student. And the way to make it easy for the student is to help them to identify what they're going to hear the most coming out of my mouth. There are very common patterns that are used, which I've identified, which they'll commonly hear all the time. Vocabulary is just pasted onto these patterns to change differences in feelings. If you happen to be Korean, there's this section here. This is my niece's name, Lee Hyo-jin, and she came and she studied with me, and I, since I speak a bit of Korean, these are the identical patterns for each of the lessons, all the 40 lessons that I have. So, in Korean, they would simply add the verb to this in order to make I can. This is, I have to. So I've done this in Korean. I don't have it in any other language, but if you're Korean, you can benefit from this general flow on how I teach. So the focus here is that when you look at the podcast, I'm adding extra lessons to these quite randomly. If they don't have a third one of these for a photo, I'll just make 1 to 28 and go to lesson 28 and add that. And that will have all of the patterns that we've learned from 1 to 28. So by constantly reinforcing the patterns, I'm constantly having them gain confidence that what they're saying and hearing is very predictable. We have a breadth of feelings that we have to express, and the fallacy is that vocabulary in itself will express an emotion, when in fact patterns along with a vocabulary word will help to express the emotion. So you're basically teaching people how to express themselves naturally. They don't need to know a lot of vocabulary. Many people just want to be able to hold a basic conversation. They want to travel and feel comfortable speaking English. They don't want to be able to read a newspaper or to read a novel. They just want to be able to easily communicate. And what this system of studying these 40 hours gives them a way that they can systematically learn patterns. Just like math, you can't introduce algebra to a first or second grader. I don't believe they do that. It's just too complicated. In this you don't start with hour 40. It's too complicated for them. You begin with hour 1, and so people will go at their own pace, how they feel comfortable. So in the podcast, once again, the additional segments that I put into the podcast are simply put in here because I've want to add another segment. For example, with this, I only have these 2, which are with photos, focusing on patterns that we learn in 1 to 2. I'll make another one soon that'll go 1 to 2P3. Just 3 is just the third one. So I hope that's been helpful. If you have any questions, feel free to contact me. There's contact information here regarding my email address, etc. So thank you.